All right, welcome to the Otherppl Show, a weekly podcast featuring in-depth interviews with today's leading writers. I'm Brad Listi here in Los Angeles. This is my podcast. Welcome to it. Hope you're okay. Hope you're hanging in there. Hope you're hanging on wherever you happen to be. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button wherever you listen. You can also subscribe on YouTube, and you can follow me on Blue Sky and Instagram. So I'm very excited today to welcome S.A. Cosby onto the show for the first time. He is celebrating the publication of a new novel called King of Ashes, available from Flatiron Books. S.A. Cosby is one of our finest writers of crime fiction. King of Ashes is a Southern crime epic and a riveting thriller. I loved it, and I had a wonderful conversation with S.A. Cosby. Can't wait to share it with you. It's coming up momentarily. A reminder before we get going that I have a weekly email newsletter. I would love it if you signed up over at bradlisti.substack.com. And I have a new company in the works. I've been talking about it. It's called Deep Dive, and it specializes in the creation of educational audio. The debut course from Deep Dive is going to be launching soon. The company is going to be launching soon. And the debut course is called How to Write a Novel. It features more than 50 hours of instruction from dozens of today's leading writers, including Emily St. John Mandel, Todd Goldberg, Melissa Broder, Madeline Lucas, Vivi Ganeshananthan Chistahakpur, Matt Bell, Matthew Salasis, Hannah Pittard, Lynn Steger-Strong, Vauhini Vara. The list goes on. It's an epic course in writing, and it's coming soon from Deep Dive. If you want to join the waitlist, you can do so at www.deepdive.audio, and you can follow Deep Dive on Blue Sky and Instagram. I will be letting you know here on the show when things are ready to roll. It's going to be happening soon. So my guest once again is S.A. Cosby. His new novel is called King of Ashes, available from Flatiron Books. S.A. Cosby is a New York Times bestselling writer. He is from southeastern Virginia. His novels include All the Sinners Bleed, which was on more than 40 Best of the Year lists, including Barack Obama's. His other novels include Razorblade Tears, which was an Edgar Award finalist, and another one called Blacktop Wasteland, which was the winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. S.A. Cosby has also won the Anthony Award, the ITW Thriller Award, the Barry Award, the Macavity Award. He has been on quite a run over the past several years and has established himself as a leading writer of crime fiction and just a wonderful writer, period. And I'm very pleased to have him here on the show and to be able to share our conversation with all of you right now. So let's get to it. Here I am with S.A. Cosby.
I think the South is a place that is mired in sort of these contradictory social ideas. It's a place of, there's so many churches in the South. My hometown is a small southern town, and it has like 23 churches. So there's this idea of morality as evidenced by, the strong Bible Belt feeling. But the South is also a place of, joyous hedonism. It's the home of the blues. It's the home of country music. Growing up, I was surrounded by people who love to entertain, have barbecues and parties and cookouts. And of course, race, because the South is this, place of America's original sin. The blood and shame of slavery exist here even today. It's ever present. Reminders and sort of historical references are all around me. Even as a young child, I saw that. And of course, class. The structure of the antebellum South was based on class, was based on a rigid hierarchy that still sort of bleeds into our lives today as Southerners. And so for me, when you talk about Southern fiction, whether it's William Faulkner or Alice Walker or Carson McCullers or Ernest J. Gaines or Jasmine Ward or anyone like that. We're writers that I think uniquely struggle with those three things. And I think those three tenets are the underpinning of most, no, or not all, but most Southern fiction, at least the Southern fiction that I enjoy.
And in King of Ashes, your setting is Southern Virginia, right? And that's the area in which you grew up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, Virginia. It's so funny because there are people who will say Virginia is the South Light because it's not Mississippi, it's not Alabama. But I grew up 45 minutes from Richmond, which was the former home of the capital of the Confederacy. I grew up in a town where a Confederate statue stands in front of the courthouse. I feel that I am, steeped in Southern lore and Southern trappings. And so for me, the books I write are my attempt to sort of, I don't want to say unravel the South, but to understand the place that I live. Because for all the grotesqueness that people associate with the South and Southern living, there's beauty here too, if you're brave enough to seek it. And so, yeah, I usually set all my books here in the South, in Virginia, because I feel it's partly my duty, I think, to talk about the South, talk about Virginia. When you see Virginia in popular fiction or in movies, it's always, the CIA or Quantico or something like that. And there's so much more to the state than just, the Jason Bourne sort of underpinnings that exist in fiction.
Well, and I think too, it has been noted about your work that a lot of like Black noir crime fiction is set in urban environments, whereas your books tend to be set in, like you say, the rural South. And not only that, I don't think any of your novels, I guess one of your novels is about a sheriff, but typically your books center on like everyday men who are kind of caught in extraordinary circumstances and are maybe seeking redemption. I'd love to hear you talk about that tendency in your work.
Yeah. So it's funny, when I first started writing my very first novel, I had a different agent than I have now, and he was trying to sell it. And we would get all these rejections from people. And they would say things like, we really like it, but it doesn't feel like it's Black enough. And I used to always chuckle at that. I was like, I'm Black, so I think that qualifies as Black enough. But there's this sort of, I think at the time, this sort of misunderstanding or conventional wisdom, air quotes, that, Black readers and people who wanted to read about Black stories only were interested in, stories set in metropolitan or urban areas. And, for me, again, growing up in the South, that was always so ridiculous to me because, Black culture, Black history is interwoven into not only the history of the country, but particularly the history of the South. And so when I started writing, I wanted to write about the people that I knew. My father, my grandfather, my mother, my aunts, my uncles, all the folks that I grew up with. And not just, the African-American or Black folks that I grew up with, but also the white folks that are here, the indigenous folks that live here, the Hispanic or Latino cultures that exist here. And so when I sat down and really craft these stories, I wanted to use characters that I was familiar with to sort of start the story. But I do try to encompass all those type of different characters in the books. But yeah, I think somebody called me one time the Bard of Broken Men as a joke. But I guess I kind of will take that title because I, in many ways, have felt broken myself. And so writing about these characters, and I typically write about male characters, is an attempt for me to understand myself, but also, understand my father. We had a pretty difficult relationship for a while. It's much better now. But yeah, my writing was an attempt to understand sort of the male mystique that I grew up with. And what does that mean? Both the toxic aspects of that, but also the things that I found honorable in it. Even with All the Sinners Bleed with Titus, who plays a sheriff who is not my typical lead protagonist, he's still someone trying to understand himself, trying to figure out who he is as a man and what does that mean and what does that look like, even while he's wearing a sheriff's badge. So those are stories that I'm really interested in. And, as an artist, as a writer, I'm trying to push myself And so I do sort of write about different things, but that idea of what does it mean to be a man and masculinity, I think is something that will always be a part of my work, even on the periphery.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that popped into my head when you were talking about, wanting to explore male characters who feel broken, like the thing that flashed into my brain is like all men are broken. Or just that, there is I just talked to Andrew Lipstein on this show. His novel's all about like the kind of crisis of masculinity that we find ourselves in, and that I think has been well documented. It's like, it feels like we're in an unstable moment when it comes to that understanding. Like, what does it actually mean and how should we function? And it seems pretty clear to me that like we're kind of off the rails in terms of how we raise young boys. And I think, I don't know, men have a lot of issues. And so it makes sense to me that fiction writers would be exploring, especially male fiction writers would be exploring this. And in King of Ashes, just to kind of give listeners like a broad strokes idea of the setup, you have a protagonist named Roman Carruthers, who is a successful financial advisor. He's living in Atlanta at a remove from his rural hometown in Southern Virginia. It's called Jefferson Run. It's near Richmond. Forgive me, I did not do my customary Google search. Is Jefferson Run actual or is that fictional?
That is fictional. I made that place up, including the name, but it's based on a real city. It's based on a city in Virginia called Petersburg, Virginia, and a lot of the sort of geographical and sort of social things that I wrote about for Jefferson Run come from research I did on Petersburg.
Yeah, it felt real to me, but this is Roman's hometown. He has kind of fled it. He had a difficult family life. His mother, has died, and there's some mystery in the book that I'm not going to spoil around the cause of her death. His brother Dante is a drug addict and is dealing with that, and his sister Nevia is back home, kind of helping her father run the family business, which is a crematorium. And the entry point for the book is that the father gets run off the road, has a car accident, and then is in the hospital in a coma. And Roman gets the call and has to return to his roots, which is something that he has, I think, previously been resisting. And he has to kind of go home and confront some old ghosts and try to take care of his family. And that's the entry point to the book. His brother Dante, it turns out, has gotten into some trouble with some gangsters over drugs and drug money. And Roman, who knows his way around money, kind of steps in to try to save his brother's life, essentially, and then gets ensnared into the Jefferson Run criminal underworld, which consists of, I think the main gang is called the Black Baron Boys. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes, sir. Yep.
And then there's another gang. I think there's a rival gang. I'm totally blanking on it. But
they're called the Ghost Town Crew. That's
right, the Ghost Town Crew. So, and there's a great villain character named Torrent, who is the gang leader. He's the leader of the Black Baron Boys. He's wonderfully rendered. And I think what I love so much about reading this is that, you just have a way with plot and character, and it's an incredibly immersive story. But I loved the fact that I was in Southern Virginia in the rural South and reading crime fiction and trying to follow Roman as he navigates this kind of criminal underworld. Because as we were saying, so often I think criminal underworld, just that concept is associated with urban environments, but it exists everywhere. And I want to read a quote to you. This is you, I believe, talking about the area in which you grew up and the way that crime impacts these kinds of places. You said, quote, "Once manufacturing moved out of these places, these rural places, there was nothing left to replace it. But crime is America's great secret industry. It's our great secret empire. And when the legitimate businesses leave, crime steps in the fold. Nature abhors a vacuum, so crime steps in to fill that place."
Yeah, I definitely believe I've seen it, in my own life. I grew up in a very small town, and when I was a kid, there was all types of businesses and manufacturing. I remember there was an ice plant in our hometown. There was a flag factory, and of course, as things change and businesses move out, and corporate America decides they don't want to pay good wages to unions and so on and so forth. Those places leave, and then what you have not only is the physical abandonment of these places, but also sort of the mental and emotional abandonment. And again, people have to survive, and so people will do what they need to do, and so crime steps in, whether it's drug trafficking, gun running, even back to moonshining, which is sort of a cliche Southern criminal activity, but it was a criminal activity that was used to make money. People have to have money to live. And so I've seen it happen. And unfortunately, I've seen it happen again and again, not just in Virginia, but in North Carolina and South Carolina, all through the South. When you lose industry, people will do what they have to do to survive. And so I'm not trying to give folks a pass, but I'm also trying to be sensitive to the reality of the situation that people live in. And so in the book, Jefferson Run is one of those cities. There's a character in the book that is having a conversation with Roman where he makes a quote. He says, we used to be the number one producer of mason jars in America, and now all we make is widows and orphans. And that's sort of me saying or giving my appreciation of what these towns go through. And so it's so funny, we'll see on the news that a factory closed or a business shuttered its doors, and we sort of shrug our shoulders and sort of say under our breath, wow, that's too bad. But you don't understand that factory supported 100 families, and those 100 families supported another 100 businesses, and so on and so forth. There is a sort of interwovenness, a tapestry that becomes unraveled when, industry or businesses leave. And so, like I said, again, people will do what they have to do to survive. And again, it's not right. It's not the morally correct thing. But again, like I said, again, people, you got to put food on the table. And so I wanted to talk about that, and I don't want to call it just gentrification, although gentrification is a part of it. Again, if you allow me to elaborate a little bit, you see these places, again, where I come from in rural areas, and they've been abandoned for years. Business have been gone, warehouses sit moldering in the sun. And then, a corporation or a real estate developer will come in and knock those buildings down and build, high-rise apartments or townhouses that the people who lived there originally can't afford. And then, you have folks move in because they love the quaintness. They love the sort of tiny house mentality of living in a small rural town. And that in itself can create even more crime because now you have people who resent these people who have moved in. And so there definitely was something on my mind when I was working on the book, in addition to the other themes and things that I wanted to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, the way that it felt to me when I was reading it, and I have some experience like with smaller towns and the South. My parents are both from Louisiana, so I kind of grew up. I didn't grow up there, but I grew up going there. Mm-hmm. And I feel like the Jefferson Run of your novel really felt like its own universe. Mm-hmm. Like especially when it comes to thinking about how crime could flourish and how there could be this kind of underworld in a place like that. It's kind of insular, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess people come and go a little bit, but a lot of people are just there, and it's at a remove from a big urban environment, and it kind of functions according to its own rules in a certain sense. Like that's the way that it felt on the page. I'm wondering if that's the way that it feels in real life.
Oh yeah. Like for instance, we can talk about like the city that inspired it, Petersburg, which is a small city. Like, when I say small, in some places it would be considered a town, but it's and again, like I said, I took a lot of inspiration from Petersburg. There is a historically Black college in the book that is based on a historically Black college that is near the Petersburg city limits. So you have this really wonderful, Institute of Higher Learning. But in the city of Petersburg, which is about 40,000 people, you have, unfortunately, incredible violence based around, like you said, these insular rules, this sort of singular universe that exists there. Now, that's a little bit misleading because, like with Jefferson Run, Petersburg sits at the sort of nexus of two major interstates. Interstate I-95, which runs all the way up to New York City, and Interstate 64, which runs all the way across the state. And so what I've seen in my research and what I've seen just in watching the news is, you'll have a situation in Petersburg. Well, gangsters will come out of New York to buy guns in Virginia because it's easy to buy guns in the South. You can damn near buy a gun at a 7-Eleven if you feel like it. And so you have these guys coming out of New York City buying guns. You have these guys coming up from like Florida, in that area and bringing drugs. And Petersburg sort of becomes this way station for both of these really large criminal enterprises. And so, of course, the people there are trying to take advantage of that. And they're either facilitating the sale of guns and drugs, or they're facilitating the transport or what have you. And then what happens is rival gangs, rival crews, sort of grow up in this city, and everybody wants, to be the top dog. There was a time when Petersburg was the murder capital of Virginia for a town of, like I said, just around 40,000 people. That's incredible. And so, again, I just sort of wanted to replicate that idea that you mentioned about the insularity of this world and the people who are trapped there in many ways, who can't afford to move, who can't afford to leave, as people say, if the place is so violent, why don't you just leave? And I think that's so insulting to say that to people who can barely make a car payment, who are barely surviving, and sometimes not under any fault of their own. Sometimes it's just they are trapped in sort of the morass of this, economic black hole. And so, there's this idea in America that you have to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. But I think as Martin Luther King said, it's insulting to tell a man to pull himself up by his own bootstraps when he doesn't have enough money to buy shoes.
That's right. That's right. I mean, it's bringing to mind a subplot in your novel where there is a young woman who's kind of caught up in all of this, criminal underworld and the drug trade and all the rest. And they basically tell her, you got to get out of town.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, how, with what, where, it's not an easy calculation. It's not like she just like, has like $100,000 in her savings account and she takes off for the West Coast or something. Like, she's got nothing. Where's she going to stay? She's got nowhere to go. So it's a really important
and it's interesting
because I think people.
I'm sorry.
No, please go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, it's interesting you picked up on that. A lot of people haven't picked up on that read the book, but that character, that was intentional. I wanted you to show someone that doesn't have the resources to just pick up and go, and also they've never been out of that small town. I don't think people understand how intimidating it is when you've grown up in a small area, and in this case, where you have to just leave overnight. How do you navigate a big city? How do you learn a subway system? How do you learn, how to get around, how to move around? In the best circumstances, when you try to move on your own, it's difficult. But now this young lady is running for her life. And so, she makes certain decisions in the book that, while that may appear nonsensical to someone else, people who grew up in that environment understand. You make decisions based on the level of comfortability and expertise you have. And so, again, coming from that background that she comes from, like you said, how can she leave? How can she escape? Even at the threat of death. It's almost impossible. And so, again, I wanted to use that and other things in the book to sort of illustrate the entropy that exists in places like this.
Yeah, it's bringing to mind, like my paternal grandfather in small town Louisiana, he had several siblings, and I want to say some of his brothers, like in their whole life, never left their hometown. Like they never went anywhere, like ever, maybe as far as New Orleans might have been it, but that was it. And then I just remember hearing that at some point and being like, wow, like it never occurred to me that, people live like that, but a lot of people do. And there's something very lived in, not only in terms of like the kind of geographical knowledge and this kind of rich setting that you've created for your book, and that, is an outgrowth of your own lived experience. But I also found like the crime writing aspect of it, and the Black Baron boys and the Ghost Town crew and the characters, in those gangs and how they talk and operate, and all that stuff seemed like just so believable to me. And it made me wonder, like, how you did that. Like, is this something you had to research, or is it something that you grew up at close proximity to the point where you feel like a fluency?
It's a little column A and a little column B. So I did do some research on it, but I grew up in a small town that was economically depressed. And so I had, not myself personally, but I had family members who we're on the periphery of the crime world, or, I like to say that, small town criminals are never full-time gangsters. They're always part-time, sort of criminals. Like you may be the guy that can get somebody a gun, but you still work at the Dollar General store, or the Walmart. You may be the guy that, can get somebody, some illicit drugs, but you still, are driving a forklift at the dump, and so I knew folks like that. And through those folks, they knew people who were much more serious sort of in the criminal world. And so the ideas that exist about loyalty, about professionalism, I guess, in a way, was things that I had sort of a very nascent understanding of from listening to my older cousins talk and so on and so forth. One of the major influences on me as a young man, not just as a crime writer or an author, I had a cousin. This is going to sound like a Southern colloquial story, but I had a cousin named, his birth name was George, but his nickname was the Maul, M-A-U-L. And he got that nickname because in a bar fight, he punched a guy so hard that the doctors thought the man had been attacked with a hammer. That's a true story. I saw that fight. And he was someone who was involved in the criminal world, again, on the periphery to a certain extent, but also in more serious ways. And, he was my big cousin, and I was like 15 or 16, like he was in his 20s. And he was fun, when I was a kid. I liked him. He drove a motorcycle. He was the only African-American man in our town with a mohawk back then. He looked like Mr. T. And he was just this larger-than-life character. And so I in many ways idolized him, and I he was tough. I never saw him lose a bar fight. And so one day when I was about 16 or 17, I got my driver's license. And I had this little, as I call it, little putt-putt car. And I saw him and we were talking. He said, "Hey, what are you doing?" I was like, "Oh, I'm just hanging out." It was a Saturday on a summer day. And he says, "Hey, ride me over here to this certain town. I got to go talk to a guy." And I'm like, "Okay." And I was like, riding around with my cousin, and we go to this, we end up at this really nice house. And I park and he gets out. He's all, "Walk up with me. Walk up to the door." I'm like, "Okay." So I walk up to the door and he knocks on the door. I'll never forget it as long as I live. He opens the door and there's this white gentleman wearing like an Izod shirt with the sweater tied around his neck, the sort of cliched yuppie. And he says to my cousin, he's like, "Oh, hey, George, I'm so sorry about our misunderstanding, but I'm going to get you your money." And my cousin punched that dude straight up in the face and like tells me, "Come inside, close the door." I'm like, "Oh my God." And so basically he ended up getting his money. And I remember we were leaving and we got back to our town and I dropped him off and he kind of looks at me funny. He kind of laughs to himself. I was like, "What?" He said, he said, "You ain't no pushover, but you ain't about this." That's what he mean. He said, "You ain't about this life." He said, "I'm sorry for getting you involved in that. You need to be a part of this." And I'll never forget that, and unfortunately he ended up later on going to prison for quite a long time. And he actually passed away in prison. But there was this understanding, I think, that he had for me as a young man that, as he said, I wasn't like a pushover or anything like that. But, by that time I already had shown interest in writing and reading and trying to go to college and so on and so forth. And he didn't want that for me, and so I've always remembered that experience. And when I write about crime fiction, when I write about criminals, I write about it with a certain sense of empathy, because in another world, my cousin would have been like a mechanical engineer or an automotive engineer. He's one of the people that just grew up coming out the womb being able to fix cars. He used to fix cars up with his brother, and we race around at night and drag race and so on and so forth. And so in a different world, a better world, he wouldn't have been in that sort of predicament. And so my characters, even the villains, I try to give them a certain amount of empathy because, we all have choices in the world, but sometimes we don't have as much variety in our choices as other people do.
Well, yeah, as you were saying that, I was thinking of Torrent, who on the page comes across as a sociopath, mm-hmm. but also as somebody who's incredibly bright and mm-hmm. shrewd and, psychologically astute and all the rest. And I guess it could be easy for me to imagine if he had a wider variety of choices, that somebody like Torrent might have wound up like as like a sociopathic CEO of like a Fortune 500 company instead of like the CEO of the BBB. Do you know what I'm saying? Like definitely, he registered that way for me as a reader. And that's part of what makes him such a rich character is that,
oh, thank you.
You know, he's matching wits with Roman, who is, you know, he's a guy who got out, right? He's more mainstream in terms of his life and career as a financial advisor to a lot of really wealthy people in Atlanta. And then you have him coming up against Torrent, and they sort of recognize that, you know, each guy, I think, recognizes that he's sort of met his match in the other, and that it's going to be a chess game, you know?
Yeah,
that's part of the fun of the book.
Yeah, and that's definitely the fun when you're writing characters like that. You know, your hero is only as good as your villain. And I think, you know, for me, I sort of try to avoid cartoonish villains. You know, I don't like the sort of snidely whiplash twirling mustache sort of caricature of a villain. You know, I think there's this literary conceit that every villain is a hero in their own story. I don't really buy that. I think villains, bad people, know they're bad. They just believe the ends justify the means. And so for me, I don't go into it with this idea that the villain is this poor sort of emotional sad sack. But at the same time, like I said before, I have a certain amount of empathy for all my characters, especially the characters in the criminal world and the villains. You know, I want to approach it with the idea that these are human beings. They're doing terrible things, and maybe they're terrible people. They might even be sociopaths or psychopaths, but they're still humans, and they didn't come to this place where you meet them, you know, sort of in a vacuum. They've had experiences and traumas and things that have shaped them and shaped the way they view the world. And so for me, it's my job to make you care about them, but not care about them as much or more than the hero.
Well, it's really well rendered, and like I said, just a totally absorbing fictional world that the reader is placed into. And you know, you sort of built a name for yourself writing books in this vein that are literary crime thrillers, mysteries, page turners, you know, the Southern black noir set in rural areas, as we've been discussing. And it's, you know, your story as a writer is kind of incredible that you came up in this place. You were raised by a father who I believe worked on a scallop boat in Chesapeake Bay. And your mother was partially disabled, I read, and raised you in a trailer. Is that correct?
Yeah. So my mom had spinal stenosis pretty much from the time I was born, and it got progressively worse as she got older. And my dad and her, you know, I like to joke that they had a country divorce. They separated, but my dad didn't move but like 8 miles up the road. And so he was a fisherman, a scallopman, oysterman for about 40 years. He's still alive. He's still with us. My mom passed away in 2021. But, you know, both sides of my family gave me things that I think I take forward as a writer and as a person. You know, my mom, I was surrounded by my mom's side of the family growing up. So all of them were readers. My mom read historical novels and Greek mythology, and she was fascinated with history and stuff. And she used to make me and my brother, if we wanted money, which we didn't always have a lot of money at all, but when there was a little extra money, she would make us solve riddles if we wanted to get like an allowance. And I'll never forget my brother was like 16. He said, I'm going to get a job because I can't deal with these riddles, man. I can't handle this. And so, but my mom was a big reader. My aunt was a big horror fan. So she gave my first like Stephen King and Clive Barker and Robert Bloch books. My uncle, who lived nearby, was a huge crime fiction fan, huge detective fan. He gave me like books by Raymond Chandler and Mickey Spillane and Ross McDonald and so on and so forth. But yeah, we were pretty poor growing up. As my mom's disability got worse, it was hard for her to work until she finally, you know, had to apply for disability, you know, support from the government. And, you know, we grew up in a single wide trailer, a little small trailer, and, you know, in a field down here in Virginia. And, you know, but I always tell people, you know, we grew up really poor, but I never felt, I knew we were poor, but I never felt bad about it. You know, I had a lot of love around me. My grandparents and my grandmother and my grandfather specifically were just really loving people. My aunts, my uncles, everybody was really just really loving and encouraging. I used to love going to I call it cookouts, but a barbecue. I used to love going to barbecues with my mom's family because all my family members on that side were like raconteurs and orators, and they would tell long, funny stories, but then they would also like joke each other or roast each other. And so I was always surrounded by this sort of verbal linguistics, gymnastics that I really enjoyed. And then from my dad's side of the family, my dad is a big guy. Like, I'm a big dude. My dad's a big dude, but my dad never touched me in anger. Never, my whole life. He's a very quiet guy. He's very contemplative. He's the type of man that it takes a lot to get him angry. That being said, once he gets angry, all bets are off. But I learned a lot about being a man from him, even though he wasn't in my life all the time. I never, ever saw him yell at my mom or argue with her, raise his hand to her in any way. And my mom was a character. Let me tell you, my mom liked to push buttons. But I remember one day I was talking to my dad when I was an adult after we had sort of reconnected. And I was talking about my mom, and I was kind of joking about her a little bit. She had passed. I said, Mom was a pistol. And he was like, yeah, he said, but the thing about being a man is, it's not tough to be violent. He said, the toughest thing is to be gentle. I've never forgotten that. It's something I don't have kids. I don't anticipate having children, but it's something that I do think about when I write. The toughest men, the toughest people are the people who know how to be gentle. And so I took the literary and the writing from my mom's side and sort of the personal ethos and philosophy that I write about from my dad's side. And, I'm thankful for both.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because you were like talking about growing up and sort of having proximity to like some criminal activity and just gang activity and all that kind of stuff. And then I also have seen you describe your childhood as kind of like pastoral and like Huck Finish, in terms of what your boyhood was like living out there. So it was a mix. It was a blend.
Oh yeah,
and
definitely.
There were a lot of books in your life, and you grew up in this double wide. I want to say I read that it was near a bar, like you grew up kind of behind a bar, and you witnessed your first bar fight when you were 11. I gotta ask, when you witnessed your first bar fight at 11, was this the mall? Was this the punch that somebody thought was a hammer?
This was actually his brother, his brother, Haywood. And so we grew up in this trailer, and we grew up behind like a local bar, right? And I guess in some areas it would be called a roadhouse, maybe, or a honky tonk or something like that. And we were obviously at 11. I was not supposed to be in there, but my brothers and I snuck in because this had like two doors. And so the front door was always manned by like a doorman or a bouncer or what have you. But the back door was always like, it was just a screen door. So we would just sneak in. And, of course, we would get run out. Once they noticed that they were running. But, it was sort of the beginning of this sort of fascination I had with Southern, the places where Southern culture, is both, for me, most raw is church and a bar. And so being in this bar and seeing, people I knew from the neighborhood, seeing men and women that I knew, in one way, but see them cut loose and sort of relax and sort of express themselves was always fascinating for me. But yeah, I saw my first bar fight at 11. I saw my cousin. I say these things and people think I'm making them up or I'm trying to be exaggerated, but I swear to God, I saw my cousin slap a man so hard his pants fell off. That man's pants fell down. He was knocked unconscious. And I remember them carrying him out. People picked him up and they carried him outside to like get him some air. And so of course then we would run out like, get out of here. The guy used to own it. He used to always yell at us. And but it was very Huck Finn. It was very Mark Twain. It was very, like I said, sort of bucolic and pastoral. I mean, I learned to swim swinging off of a rope from a tree that was overhanging a river, and I used to grow up, we used to go to what we'll call field parties, which basically was a bunch of people get their cars and you put them in a circle in the middle of a field and you start a bonfire, and you're like 15 or 16 and, and stuff like that. And so it was all of that, and so, like I said, even though we were really poor, I had a really happy childhood in many ways. Of course, as anyone, there were difficulties at times. My mom and her physical disabilities were hard to deal with sometimes, but I never felt unloved. I was never in a situation where I felt like people didn't care about me. And so again, all of that sort of works its way into my work. But I also know that I am very, very, whatever you want to call it, lucky, blessed, what have you, to be able to come from that background and tell stories. I've written books that have taken me around the world, from this little, I had a moment, if you indulge me really quick, I had a moment last year. I was in Paris, France for an event called Quai du Polar. It's a huge crime fiction event in Europe. And, in Europe, crime fiction is not seen as genre, it's seen as literature, as viable as any other form of literature. Anyway, I'm over there and I'm sitting at a literal cliched Paris cafe. I'm about 150, maybe 200 feet from the apartment that Ernest Hemingway lived in when he wrote Movable Feast. And I had this really just incredibly emotional moment, and I'm sitting there and I'm drinking a cup of coffee, eating a croissant, as one does. And it just hit me that, I come all the way from the small town of Matthews County, Virginia, population of 8,000 people. And I know all of them and I'm related to half of them. And here I am, I'm in Paris, in a pair of Chuck Taylors, sitting on a cafe, listening to Edith Piaf, pour through the speakers because of books, because of things I wrote, because of the words that came out of my head. And it moved me to tears because, this isn't supposed to happen for people like me, people that come where I come from. And it did. And I am eternally grateful to all the things that the influences and the people that, helped me get there. And so, for me, it's just an incredible honor, to get to tell stories for a living. I have a friend named Jordan Harper, who's a writer, he lives in LA now. He's from the Ozarks. But he said, man, we got the best job in the world, because it ain't a job, and I definitely agree with that.
So the first thing that you can recall writing, I believe, was a 75-page werewolf story that you composed in 6th grade. And it was so gruesome that it got you sent to the school psychiatrist. True or false?
That's a true story. So I used to write stories for my friends. I've been writing stories since I was 7. And that was my most ambitious project, was this 75-page werewolf novella. And I was passing around to my buddies in class. And one of the teachers intercepted it. And she said, what is this? And I was like, oh, it's just a story I wrote. And she starts flipping through it. And I think she got to the scene where the werewolf bites the head off of a kid. And she was she called the principal, and it became a whole thing. And I had to go talk to the school psychologist, who actually was really kind to me and said, to effect, is he doesn't have any mental issues. He's just very creative, give him something to do with his creativity. And so I remember my mom, she was so mad at me, and she was like, stop writing these scary stories. You're going to get in trouble. And, but then later on, I encountered a teacher when I was in the 11th grade named Jeff Bone, Mr. Bone. And I was still writing stories. I just wasn't writing as gruesome stories as much. And I also used to write stories about the teachers that I didn't like. I liked Mr. Bone. I didn't like some other teachers. And again, passing notes, passing stories in class to my friends, which I guess today kids would do it on text message, but whatever. And Mr. Bone intercepted it, and he made me stay after class, but he didn't get me in trouble. He didn't send me to the school psychologist. He basically wanted to talk to me about, did I have an interest in creative writing? Did I want to be a writer? And he said to me, this is really good. He said, I advise you to stop writing about teachers, but this is really unique. You have a really unique voice. You should definitely think about pursuing this. And, I was really poor. I didn't think about going to college. I didn't, when I thought about after high school was getting a job. And so at the end of that year, he gave me 2 books. I still have them. He gave me this little thin book called The Elements of Style by Strunk and White. And he gave me this really massive book, which was the collected works of Samuel Beckett. He said, the first book will teach you how to write, and the second book will teach you why you write. And so he's just a huge influence in my life. And I did end up going to college for a couple years. Unfortunately, my mother's physical disabilities got worse, and so I had to drop out. And so I would see him around town until he retired. He moved away. And he would always ask me, are you still writing? And I would kind of, shake my head and chagrin the way. Say, yeah, kind of, I guess. He always tell me, don't give up. Don't give up. So fast forward about 15 years, maybe almost 20 years. And I'm doing a book signing in my hometown. And I hadn't seen Mr. Bone in decades. I didn't know where he was. I found out later that he and his wife had retired to Europe, and he was teaching English to, former Eastern Bloc country, because that's the kind of guy he is. And I hear this voice as I'm signing books, and I was like, Mr. Cosby, and I look up, and it was him. He had come from Estonia to be there for my book signing. And he comes over to the desk.
No kidding.
Get emotional thinking about it. He comes over to where I'm signing the books, and he puts his hands on my shoulders, and he's like, I knew you would do it. I knew it. And I was a mess after that. Oh my God, I started crying. It was just a mess. But yeah, he came all the way to see me sign books in our hometown. So, again, people that believed in me and supported me and encouraged me. And, I feel very honored that I'm able to do this. I feel like I honor them when I write my books. So, again, I don't take any of this for granted, and it's so funny because I think people now, when they meet me like at book signings or stuff, I don't know what they expect me to be, but, I don't know. I don't take myself very seriously. I take the writing seriously. I'm just happy. I feel like a kid who's like, gotten on a tour bus of his favorite band. Like, I just feel happy to be here. So,
yeah. Well, you said you didn't finish college, and you were helping to take care of your mother, I would assume, and then you started working at I want to say like a Lowe's hardware store.
Yeah.
And you were there for more than a decade, and that was kind of your gig for, I would imagine, what, your 20s?
Yeah, my mid-20s. So I had a lot of different jobs. I did a lot of crazy stuff. Like at one point after I dropped out of college, my mother went to a rehabilitation center for about 4 months, and I took that opportunity to visit some friends in the western part of America in New Mexico. So I did my kind of Jack Kerouac thing for a summer. I came back. I did a lot of different jobs. I was a bouncer for a while. I did landscaping and stuff. And, I got this job at Lowe's, and it actually, ended up being in the context of having a steady job. It was really good. Like, it was a really good place. I grew up at Lowe's. I grew up as a person, I think, there. And so, I was still writing, but I still was kind of doing the same thing in high school. I was just passing stories around to my friends, and I didn't really understand. I wanted to write professionally. I just didn't understand how to get there. And I had the good fortune of working with a guy who was retired, but in his previous life, he used to be a concert promoter. He was in the entertainment industry, and he was the one that advised me. He's like, you got to go. If you want to be a writer professionally, he said, you're good enough to do it. Because I showed him some of my stories. He said, you got to go to where the writing people are, conventions, workshops, writing festivals. You've got to go there and meet these people, because that's the only way you're going to make contacts and network. And I used to be really disdainful of the word network, and I just thought it was very bourgeoisie, so to speak. But he was right. I don't know if I'd be writing professionally if he hadn't given me that advice, because he encouraged me to go to these places. And at the time, I had published a couple short stories here and there and in various magazines. One magazine in particular was called Thug Lit. It was a crime magazine of hard-boiled, hardcore crime fiction. And the guy who ran that magazine, Todd Robinson, who's still a good friend of mine, also encouraged me to go to writing conventions and writing festivals and stuff. And eventually I saved my money and working at Lowe's, and I saved enough money to go to a writing convention. And that's where I met my current agent, and it changed everything for me. It's so funny because I think a lot of people think everything happened overnight, but it did. I've been writing for a long time. And I had one agent that I had gotten because of a short story, and that agent dropped me after 6 months because he didn't think he could sell my work, and which I think he regrets that now. And so what happened was there was a big writing festival called BoucherCon. It's a huge crime writing festival that moves around the country every year. And this particular year was going to be in St. Petersburg, Florida. It was on the East Coast. I saved enough money for a flight, a round trip ticket. And I went to this event, and I didn't know what I was doing. I just was there. I was like, well, I'm going to go to this writing event. And I saw all these writers that I had admire, Dennis Lehane's there, Walter Mosley, Louise Penny, cozy writers, hardboiled writers, with all these different iterations of the crime fiction genre. And a friend of mine, so this is sort of my writing origin story. A friend of mine was the moderator for a panel on Southern crime fiction, and he asked me to join the panel. And I was like, man, I'm not a writer of note. I don't have anything really big out. And he was like, it doesn't matter, man. You know a lot about this. You're a great conversationalist. It's going to be fun. I'm like, all right. So I'm on there with like professional writers like Ace Atkins, and Alex Segura, and Steph Post. These are writers who've been published and have books out. And here I am with just, my little short stories and stuff. And anyway, it ended up being so much fun. Those guys and gals were so giving to me and so open to me. And we had a wonderful time. And then at the end of the panel, they were opening the floor for questions. And this lady gets up and she has a very thick Southern accent. And she's, well, I have more of a comment than a question. And Ace Atkins, who's a big dude, former football player for Auburn, nudges me in the arm. He said, here we go. And so to paraphrase her comment, she felt that we were being very negative about the South. We had talked about the South and Southern history and Southern fiction and so on and so forth. And she said, I think the South is a beautiful place. And I was like, okay, I'm with you there. I get it. I'm from the South. And then she said, the history of the South is also beautiful. Like, think of the antebellum period. I know it was difficult for some people, but, it was a wonderful time for fashion and etiquette. And you could hear a pin drop in that room. And my friend, who was the moderator, who's the instigator of the first class, says to me, Sean, would you like to respond to that? And I was like, I would love to respond to that. So I sort of made a joke. I said, ma'am, I love a bustle skirt as much as the next person, but the antebellum period wasn't just quote unquote difficult for some people. It was hellish for a lot of people. And so anyway, it got a big laugh and sort of took the tension out of the room. And later on, I swear to God, it's a true story. I was walking away from that panel and a guy comes up to me and he says, hey, my name is Josh Getzler. I'm a literary agent. And I really love what you said in there about, your ideas and stuff, but I also love the way you handled that racist lady. And he says, do you have representation? I said, no, actually, I got dropped about 6 months ago by an agent. He hands me a business card. And he says, hey, when you get home, send me some stuff. I'd love to maybe chat with you. And I get home and I thought about it for a while and I sent him the manuscript that was eventually became my book, Blacktop Wasteland. That was November of 2018. He signed me as a client in December of 2018. He sold Blacktop Wasteland to Macmillan Publishing in February of 2019. So after 20 years of writing, my life changed overnight. And I've been a professional writer ever since.
So Blacktop Wasteland was the breakout.
Yeah. Yeah, it changed everything. It changed my whole life, And you know what's so funny about that? That came out or was scheduled to come out in June of 2020. Of course, nobody knew the pandemic was going to happen. And so then, of course, when the pandemic, fell on us, I thought, well, that's it. My dream is over. That book's going to die on the vine. And, I'm sure as we all knew, what happened was people reverted to things they could do by themselves. And reading was one of those things. And Blacktop Wasteland sort of built this word of mouth during the summer of 2020 into the spring of 21. And it got nominated for a bunch of awards. It won the LA Times Book Prize for mystery fiction. It won the American Library Association's Black Library Caucus Award. It won the Anthony, the Barry, the Macavity. These are all names of specific mystery writing awards. It was nominated for the Edgar. And so, like I said, the pandemic was horrible and horrific. I lost friends and family during the pandemic. But also it I think gave that book a chance that maybe it wouldn't have gotten if people were out and about, unfortunately. And then, I wrote Razorblade Tears, which was bigger than Blacktop, and that got on a lot of best of lists. It was a bestseller. It was on former President Obama's summer reading list as one of the books he enjoyed. And it just felt like, it started feeling like I was riding on a bullet, like it started slow and then it just took off. And, there's been moments in since then where I'm like, what is actually happening? Like, what is going on? Like, and so, and now we're at a point where my career where like all my books are optioned for movies, or TV. I've won other awards. Like I said, I've traveled, pretty extensively throughout Europe and almost every state in the Union. Again, it comes back around to being very lucky, but also I think, being in the right place at the right time, and hard work. I used to be very self-deprecating, like in interviews like we're having right now. I used to be like, well, if I can do it, anybody can do it. It's no big deal. I'm no big deal, whatever. And my friend Jordan told me, he said, man, stop saying that. Stop saying that. He said, if everybody could do what we do, they would do it. What you do is special. What I do is special, and there's a quote that I think about from Alan Moore, the comic book writer who wrote The Watchmen. And he says and I'm paraphrasing, he says, everybody knows somebody who read a book that changed their life. We're writers, and what we do is serious. We're the myth makers. And I like that. I like that idea.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And, it takes some luck and some good timing, but it also takes talent and hard work. And you certainly have a ton of talent, and you've certainly done the work. And, you mentioned this kind of serendipitous meeting with your agent, Josh Getzler, at BoucherCon in St. Petersburg. And I think, there are a lot of listeners of my show who are writers or aspiring writers. And I'd just like to hear you talk a little bit more about how you feel Josh's presence in your creative life. What role does a great agent play in making things happen? Do you know what I'm saying? Because I can imagine your work would have found a way one way or another. It's just too strong. But certainly once you started working with Josh, you haven't been broke since, right?
Yeah. You ain't lying. He changed my life, he changed my life. I owe him. He'll say I don't, but I'll say it. I owe him everything. Having an agent. Here's the thing. I've had a bad agent and I've had a really great agent. And having a bad agent is almost worse than having no agent, because, a bad agent will wrap you up in these dreams and these ideas. And, we all want to be successful. Don't get me wrong. I love the art. I wrote a long time before I got paid, but let's be real. We want to get paid. We want to be compensated. We want to live as a working writer. And a bad agent the relationship with an agent is like a relationship with a good friend or a relationship. You have to be simpatico. You have to understand each other. They have to get you in a way that maybe other people don't. They have to understand what you're trying to say and what you're trying to do. They have to understand you as a person. And a bad agent is not a bad person. That's not what I'm saying. But there's somebody who don't get you. There's somebody who doesn't understand you. They may try to change things about you instead of accepting you for who you are and working to accentuate the skills that you have. What Josh did for me was he took sort of the raw clay of my ideas and my stories and the things I wanted to do, and he basically molded them. For instance, his introductory letter, to back up, when you send a book out to different publishers, your agent, if they're a good agent, will write a really cool, really strong query letter, introductory letter describing the project that you're working on. And he described Blacktop Wasteland, I'll never forget it, as a Spike Lee, as a Bruce Springsteen song in the guise of a Spike Lee movie set in the Deep South. That is the best description of anything I've ever written by anybody. And, he was so passionate about it. And he was such a strong advocate for it. But also, that's the artistic side. On the business side, Josh has been in the business for a long time. He has a lot of great connections. He's known as a straight shooter by different publishing houses and different editors. He's someone who is immersed in sort of the publishing world. And so he's someone who can make those connections for you, who has those contacts. And when he believes in something, he goes 100% for it. He goes 100 miles an hour. Also, he has really good instincts. For instance, the original version of Blacktop Wasteland ended with the main character dying. I had this whole sort of Hamlet-esque scene that I wanted to do at the end of the book. And Josh was very gentle about it. But he said, I just don't think that's the right choice. I think you've come too far with this character for people to lose him at the end. He said, just do me a favor. Try to write a scene where he doesn't die in a hail of bullets and see how it feels. And what I learned from that was I realized the ending that the book deserved, I was afraid to write it because I was afraid to go to the emotional depths that you need to write that scene. And this isn't a spoiler, I hope, but the end of Blacktop Wasteland, as it is published, is the main character talking to his wife and being honest with her about what he's done and how he's brought violence and terror into their lives because of his hubris. And at the time, I don't think I was ready to have that conversation. And Josh encouraged me to do it. He had the instinct that that's the ending the book needs. And so, a good agent, they're your greatest advocate. They're your biggest cheerleader. But they're also the person that speaks truth to power to you as a writer and an artist. And you have to be willing to accept that. You have to be willing to accept constructive criticism to get better as a writer. Even now, as our friendship relationship has become very successful, I still wait and accept his constructive criticism because I know he has my best interest at heart. It's not a criticism to make me feel bad. It's a criticism to make me write better.
Yeah. I mean, it's like resonates everything that you're saying. And, every writer I think dreams of having a literary agent who's enthusiastic about them and who is hardworking and a straight shooter and understands the business and has great connections and is smart and industrious and all the rest. But I think maybe the special sauce in a great agent writer partnership is that the agent is truly a fan of your work and a very astute reader, maybe like a uniquely astute reader of it. Like when you have that ingredient, then I think you've really got something. I've never really maybe articulated that out loud in so many words, but it really makes sense that if you could find an agent who really just like vibes with what you do and gets it like completely and is willing to invest the time and energy, and effort that it takes to really engage with the work, that's probably going to lead to success.
Oh, yeah, I definitely agree with that. Like I said, and you're right. I think your agent has to be the most enthusiastic fan of your work. And because, that allows them to go talk to publishers and go talk to other entertainment and media outlets with a certain set of passion. People can feel it when you're passionate about something. It's like going on a date, right? You go on a date and you may like somebody, but you're not super passionate about them. And, and then you meet somebody that just makes your heart sparkle, it makes your eyes light up and you can tell the difference. And I think publishers can tell when an agent is in love with a book and when they think it's a good concept. Those are two different things.
Well, there's another quality to your work that I want to discuss, and you kind of touched on it in this talk about agents and stuff, but it's the cinematic quality of the work. Like I had an incredibly powerful like cinematic / visual experience reading your novel. And you mentioned that your books have been optioned for the screen. That doesn't surprise me at all. I'm curious to hear about like that phase of the operation, like whether or not you're involved in it, like as a screenwriter, or if you're hands off. And then also like what's the status of the various projects that you have in the pipeline?
Yeah, thank you. I do tend to write in a cinematic way. I actually see the story in my head. Like I visualize it. And also I'm a huge fan of cinema, a huge fan of films. I grew up watching movies, with my parents and my grandparents. And some of my favorite memories are like going to a movie theater by myself for the first time. So I love that sort of cinematic quality to fiction. As far as the status of stuff, the two projects that are probably the furthest along are the film version of my book Razorblade Tears, that was optioned by Bruckheimer Productions and in association with Apple Films, that has a directing and writing duo attached to it. I think now we're just waiting for the ink to dry on some of the contracts before they get going. The other one that's really far along is All the Sinners Bleed. Is going to be a limited run TV series on Netflix in association with Amblin Entertainment and Higher Ground Productions, which is former President Obama's production company. Obviously everybody knows Amblin and Steven Spielberg. That's just got greenlit. They have the first, I think, 3 episodes written. They're going to start casting soon. So both of those are moving forward quite rapidly. As far as my involvement, like with All the Sinners Bleed, I have an executive producer credit. The folks at Netflix have been really giving and really kind to me about involving me in the process as much as I want to be. And I'm interested in it, but I do think that my expertise, if you want to call it, lies in writing novels. But I do enjoy being involved to a certain extent and them allowing me to see how the sausage is made to a certain degree. With the film, I'm not really involved in an official capacity, but I've met the director and the writer, and they're really great guys. Their names are Trayvon Free and Martin Rowe. They won an Oscar a few years ago for a short film, a short film called Between Two Distant Strangers. They're an incredibly creative, incredibly well-regarded duo, and I can't wait to see what they do with the work. And I'm kind of, got to be friends with them. Whenever I'm in LA, we hang out, have dinner, have a drink or two, and they're really, really, just really talented guys. And I really trust them implicitly to take care of, as I call them, my boys, the two main characters from Razorblade Tears. So I am enjoying the process of this. I'm sort of, like I said, a fan of it in a way. So I'm not as involved as maybe some other writers are. I feel like my wheelhouse is writing the books, and I let other people who are experts in their field take the stuff and run with it. Walter Mosley, who's sort of a mentor, not just to me, but to a whole generation of writers, but specifically African-American writers, said to me one time about people adapting your work. He said, somebody adapting your work is like somebody coming to your house and cooking in your kitchen. As long as they don't burn the building down and nobody gets food poisoning, it's going to be all right. So I kind of take that attitude about the work. I'm not as precious about it as other people are, I guess, in a way, because I know it's got to change. You can't film the whole book as a movie or what have you. Things have to be taken out, things have to be changed. But, my books will always be there. So the movie's one entity and the book's another entity, and you can enjoy both separately or together if you feel like. And that's sort of the way I look at it as well.
So when one of your books gets optioned by Higher Ground, does Barack Obama call you? Like, you ever talk to Barack or no?
It's funny. I've never really talked about this before, but he sends you a little note thanking you for trusting them with your work, which I got the note and I thought it was a joke. I have a friend who does a lot of practical jokes, and I thought it was him messing with me. So I called him because I was going to just tear it up, and I called him. I said, "Hey, man, did you send me like something from FedEx from the office of did you go to, Home Office Depot and print up something that says from the office of former President Barack Obama?" And he got really quiet on the phone. He said, "No, I didn't. I swear to God, it's not me." And he was like, open it. And I was like, okay. So it was a really nice note. I have that framed as one should. So yeah, it's an incredible experience to know the president or the former president of the United States has read your work. Then for me, I get instantly embarrassed because there's so many curse words in it. I feel like it's like cursing in front of my mom. It's like, I'm not a bad person, Mr. President, I promise.
I think he can handle it. He's worked in politics. He's seen a lot worse and heard a lot worse. Yeah. So last thing I want to ask you, I think I forgot to ask you this at the top, but King of Ashes, centers in some respects on this family business in Jefferson Run. The Carruthers family business is a crematorium. Mm-hmm. And I want to say I read that you worked for a spell as a mortician's assistant. Is that right?
Yeah. So I worked briefly for a funeral home. And, what's funny? I did that. So what happened was I was working full-time at Lowe's, and I started getting a little bit of writing notoriety and success and everything. And I figured out that I needed more time to write. I was working a lot of hours. I used to work like 50 hours a week at Lowe's. And so someone I knew owned a funeral home. And so I stepped down from Lowe's and started working there part-time and writing, more full-time. And the thing that taught me, the thing that I learned being around that industry, first of all, the people that do that are just incredible people. It takes a special person to do that job. But the thing I learned was just the ability to just give empathy to people. You see people at a funeral home in the worst moment of their lives, and everybody handles that differently. And what I learned watching that from a distance was learn how to give people grace, learn how to, give people empathy, learn how to give people space. The way you encounter somebody the first time is not always the way they are all the time. And so, again, giving people that grace, giving people that sort of, opportunity to present themselves in a way that is more natural than maybe you might have encountered them the first time. It's something I take into my writing. It's something I take into writing about my characters and trying to understand them. and so it really did help me a lot. Now I don't do anything but write. I'm a full-time writer, but that experience, all the experience I had in different jobs and stuff, all of that works its way into my writing. If you read my book, Razorblade Tears, one of the characters is a landscaper. I used to do landscaping for a living, and that's a very physically demanding job. If you read Blacktop Wasteland, that character likes to race cars, and I grew up around guys who were into automotives and car racing and slightly illegal drag racing. If you read All the Sinners Bleed, there's the church. It figures prominently in that book, and my mom was a huge member of our church and really was into our church. And churches play a huge role in Southern communities, and especially African-American communities. And so, King of Ashes is probably the first book where I don't have as much in common with the characters as I did in my other books. I'm not a financial advisor. I worked at a funeral home, but a crematory is a much different sort of environment than a funeral home. It's much more of a utilitarian facility. I'm not in a gang. So, it was the first time in a while where I don't have as much of a touchstone with the characters, but I do have a brother. I have a family. I understand the complexity of sibling dynamics. I don't think anybody understands you the way your brother or your sister does. That's a unique experience. That's a unique situation. My brother, I love him. He gets on my nerves sometimes, but you better not talk about him. I can talk about him. That sort of mentality is real. And I think that comes across in the book as well.
Well, it's a wonderful novel, and it's just great to meet you and to hear your story, like how all of this has happened. It's inspiring, and it's just a great story. Like, your story is a great story, the story of your career. And I feel like you say, you're riding a bullet. Is that how you said it? That's good for a crime writer, I feel like.
Yeah.
Not like a runaway horse, not like a motorcycle, but a bullet. And I always end by asking my guests if they're working on anything else. You also seem like you're really prolific and industrious, so I would imagine there's always something cooking. But are you working on a new project?
Yeah, I'm actually working on two things. I'm doing an adaptation of a Marvel character from Marvel Books, and I am doing the research for my next novel, which I think is going to be the first one that is not entirely set in Virginia. There's going to be a big section of that book set on the West Coast. And the tentative title is A Highway Full of Night. So I'm kind of working on both of those right now.
All right. Well, I really appreciate the time, and I congratulate you again, and I wish you well.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a wonderful experience.
Okay, there we have it. That was my conversation with S.A. Cosby. Totally enjoyable, right? His new novel is called King of Ashes, available from Flatiron Books. You can find him on social media. He's on Blue Sky and Instagram. Read his stuff. It's excellent. Again, the new novel is called King of Ashes, available now wherever you get your books. Don't forget to subscribe to this show wherever you listen. You can also subscribe on YouTube, and you can follow me on Blue Sky and Instagram. Sign up for my weekly newsletter over at bradlisti.substack.com. And if you listen regularly, if you love this show, I hope you'll join the Other People Patreon community over at patreon.com/otherpplpod. Help keep everything rolling. If you want to get an Other People t-shirt or a sweatshirt, or you want to join the Other People book club, you can do all of the above at the show's official website, otherppl.com. If you want to sign up for the wait list for How to Write a Novel, the debut course from Deep Dive, my new company, you can do that at www.deepdive.audio. And if you have 2 minutes and you want to do me a quick favor, please give this show a rating wherever you listen, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, etc. Rate it, review it. It helps the show find new listeners. All right, so coming up on Thursday, I should be back for another episode of Brad and Mira for the Culture. with my friend and co-host Mira Gonzalez, we will deliver this podcast's weekly pop culture assessment. So Brad and Mira for the culture coming up on Thursday. Stay tuned.